Welcome to On Point. I'm Justin Gonzalez. 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic, school campuses have slowly begun to reopen. The governor's office says 86% of California's schools now offer in-person or hybrid instruction, and many parents and educators say they're ready to get children back to school. But what kinds of struggles with mental health, academics, or social skills are students bringing back to campuses? A Public Policy Institute of California poll found that 8 in 10 parents statewide say their children are falling behind academically, especially those in lower income and English learning communities. Mental health professionals believe schools will have to be ready to serve students who are stressed, depressed, or even having trouble focusing. But school isn't only an academic experience. Students learn lessons about how to relate to others too. How will reopening schools affect students' social skills? On Point's Elizabeth Campos has more on the story.
Thank you, Justin. And now I'd like to introduce our guest, Jenny Hontz, from an advocacy organization called Speak Up Parents, Christian Perez, clinical social worker for Pasadena Unified School District, and Greg Knotts, professor in the Department of Elementary Education and ITEP coordinator here at Cal State Northridge. So let's go ahead and get started. Greg, how did virtual learning affect K through 12 children and students academically?
It's challenging, right, to answer that globally, but it was because they're going to have varying levels of more effectiveness for some students and then less effectiveness for other students. The challenge was not so much this year as it was last year, where everybody kind of had to turn on a dime. This year, I think people have settled into a certain degree of complacency or a certain degree of excitement about the delivery of instruction through the virtual medium. So I would say, popularly, I think people believe that most students have been affected negatively, making not maybe as much progress. And we won't really know that, right, until we're on the other end of this. Students who, I think because the state and federal levels have chosen different routes of academic standardized testing, we won't really know the full extent, but I would say that there's probably an equal number of students who have really thrived in the virtual environment, and then a great deal of number of students who have not progressed as much as they might have in the standard brick and mortar face-to-face delivery.
Were there any subjects specifically you felt that students were going to fall most behind, or was it just an overall plateau? Did it stay about the same?
It's an interesting question, right? Because some curricular areas were really actually set up to deliver virtual instruction. I can think of mathematics in particular. Mathematics has a lot of sources, sites that kids can use online manipulatives that are really quite remarkable. Can you do in social studies a standard, a role play in the same way that you could face-to-face and do some partner work? No. Science, you're not doing, oftentimes our science instructors were doing experiments that our kids were watching rather than doing hands-on work themselves. So, the language arts and mathematics, where we tend to, in my opinion, unfortunately put a lot of the bulk of our efforts and attention, they manage to continue to thrive in some ways in the virtual environment. But our sciences, our arts, certainly, and our social sciences really in the elementary world, just really were not able to make that leap quite as well. They get short shrift in a face-to-face brick and mortar world too, but they really did not thrive in the virtual environment.
So then moving on from academics to sort of the emotional side of it, Christian, what age group are you working with specifically? Or are your clients a little bit all over the place?
Well, I mean, mines are all over the place. I work for the school district, so I work from, I think my youngest is in third grade, and my oldest is a senior. So I got to see the whole spectrum of students.
How did virtual learning affect their emotional well-being, or were there any major differences from teens to elementary school students?
I think that, just like Craig said, it's kind of difficult to measure out. Each student is different, and there were some students who actually thrived in the virtual learning because if they had emotional kind of disturbances related to peer relations or kind of just speaking out, this whole virtual learning has actually been positive for them because they don't have that face-to-face anxiety level of interaction that they had. But we also see the other downside where all the kids that needed that one-on-one time academically or just learning wise, then we saw them actually suffer a lot through this virtual learning. So it's just a whole weight, and like Greg was saying, we won't really see the effects until, we're all out through the other side of this.
Jenny, your group is actually advocating plenty for the return to in-person learning. How do you feel now that students have returned?
Well, I think return is a term that you have to qualify it, right?
Yeah.
Right now, secondary students in LAUSD and middle and high school, their only option is to return to campus to do Zoom in the room. So they're not actually getting any access to in-person instruction. So we've seen very low numbers of families opt in. In fact, only 7% of high school students in LAUSD are back on campus. So the vast majority of families are still in virtual learning. In elementary school, they're back 5 days a week for 3 hours of instruction. And we have slightly higher numbers, about 30 to 40% of families have sent their kids back, but there's a huge disparity in terms of the communities. We see more affluent West Side communities sending their kids back in much higher numbers than in communities such as South LA and Southeast LA. So there are very large differences. And, it's a little bit all over the place right now.
You're a parent as well. What ages are your students and what are your biggest concerns with them? Is it academics, their social lives?
It's both. I have just one child. He's a 5th grader. He has 2 full-time working parents. So it's been a very challenging year, and he has had to learn to operate independently. It's been very difficult as a parent to sort of manage and oversee his education. Fortunately, he's old enough that he can get on all of his Zooms pretty independently and keep up. But I am very concerned that academically, he has definitely not covered all the content that he would normally cover in 5th grade. I've seen some of his skills slip backward. And I think emotionally, it was extremely challenging for an only child because it's socially isolating to be home. And so, in the fall, he kind of hit a wall and really, really wanted to go back. And, right now they've returned to campus at his school 2 days a week starting this week. It was 1 day a week for the past 4 weeks. And then now he's back 2 days a week. But the days he's not in school, they're mainly doing a lot of asynchronous work on their own independently. So yesterday he had one of those asynchronous days and he said, Mom, when am I going to just get to go back to school full time? So he really, really wants to go back. And that's not the case for every kid. There really are, in fact, there's about 30% of families who would like their kids to remain in virtual learning indefinitely. So there is definitely a demand for that. And there are differences. It's really an individual situation. Some kids, as the other speakers have said, have done better in virtual learning, but there are other kids who are really suffering from the isolation. My kid is really social. And I think, for kids who are super social and who learn through social interaction, it's hard. I also think it's very hard for the youngest kids. Kindergarten kids do not learn well on Zoom. They really need to be learning social skills with their peers. They need those manipulatives. And, it really requires a parent sitting there next to a kindergarten child to help them do it. They can't navigate it on their own independently. And so a lot of kids are not actually getting an education in kindergarten this year. We saw huge numbers of families keep their kids out of kindergarten. And next year is going to be really difficult for those kids going into 1st grade because we're going to see, again, massive disparities between kids in terms of skill level, especially for English learners who, these kids, there's a critical window for learning language. And I also want to say kids with disabilities have also really struggled with this virtual format. We did some surveys and found that about 75% of those kids are really unable to learn via screen, and many of them have regressed to the point of self-harm. So I think it's really important to understand the differences between kids and that one size does not fit all.
All 3 of you have mentioned the fact that it is really a double-sided coin where some students really desperately need to be in person and others are doing a lot better being at home. Do you think that I'm going to ask this question for all 3 of you and then I'll go one by one, but do you think that some districts waited too long, arguably, to return students to campus, even if it could have been in smaller groups? I'll go ahead and start with Jenny because she was already on the topic and we'll move on.
Yes, I think back in the fall, the health department said that the highest needs kids, 25% of them could be back on campus at once. LAUSD never let them back. Many of the surrounding districts did have kids with disabilities and high needs kids, English learners, back on campus to get their services. LAUSD didn't. They never got an agreement with the labor union UTLA, and they, had a voluntary program, but very few teachers volunteered. So those kids really did not get the services that are federally required. They're guaranteed. They didn't get them for most of the year. And so those kids have really suffered. And again, for some of them, for young kids, there's really a developmental window where if you miss it, the damage could be permanent.
That was a really good parent perspective. Thank you for that. And then, Greg, you have a little bit more experience and background with teachers. How do you think teachers feel? Do you think that the districts waited too long as from their perspective, or could they have waited longer?
Well, it depends on how you want me to answer. Do you want me to answer in an idealized world, the real world of systems and structures and unions and
whichever one is more to your preference. If you would like to give me a little bit of both, then that works fine for us.
So, I mean, the real answer is the teachers are miserable. I mean, that's an easy answer. It's unfair to kind of probably globalize that response, but it's been very, very difficult. I'm a teacher myself, just with higher ed, with bigger humans than they're dealing with in the K-12 or K-5 environment is what I know better. And the world that they're inhabiting is very difficult. Would they have preferred to go back, as soon as possible? Almost unequivocally, at least the teachers with whom I work. I work with a lot because I'm teaching in both the undergraduate world where, we had to manage student teachers, if you want to devote some of your segment to that. And then also in the master's program, those are people already in service. Those are people who are already teaching, right? So, and they have somewhere between 2 and typically 10 or 12 years of experience. So a lot of it, honestly, depended on their level of technological ability, quite frankly. There's people who have really, as teachers, thrived in this environment, and they could have easily managed a hybrid version of some kind much earlier on. Going back fully in person, I think, because most of us operated in the kind of on a hopeful level. I think that people wanted to be back as soon as they could, but then they were tempered by the reality of the impacts of both either themselves or people around them getting sick and or dying. And so then there was that level of fear that was quite probably real and prevalent versus people who were not impacted by the disease at all, other than knowing what the statistics were. So the easy answer is yes, most teachers would have wanted to go back. Anyone who is called to be a teacher, at least in the K-5 environment, really thrives on that interaction. The 2D experience does not replicate the 3D experience at all. I mean, even here, I can see, Jenny nodding, but and Christian has a little less light on him, so I can have a harder time reading, his facial expressions. We're in a room. My eyes have already been trained after 25 years of doing this to see everybody kind of simultaneously. So the 2D environment just doesn't replicate it. So did they want to go back? Yeah. So sorry for the babble, but that's what they wanted to do.
It's okay. It's perfectly fine. Moving on actually from that question and talking about this 2D world and hybrid learning, Christian, do you think that hybrid learning is satisfying children's social needs?
That's tough. It's a tough thing to say because I'm not actually in the classroom, so I can't really see the whole kind of how hybrid learning works. But I mean, to some extent, it does help the kids, them being physically in school for some part to get that social emotional kind of perspective, interacting with kids, interacting with teachers, learning to advocate for themselves. But long story short, I don't know.
Have any of your clients returned to on campus?
Yes, I have. I want to say maybe about half that wanted to go back. And most of them have had a positive experience going back to school because they miss their friends. And yeah, it's only mostly because of the friends and their downside of remote learning. There were the kids that absolutely did not like online learning.
Of course. Did you think that those children were ready to be social, or do you think that the last year really affected the way that they interacted with maybe other students or other adults?
I think some of them, it's kind of like the year didn't happen. Some of them, because there are other kids that I have been working with a long time. So there are kids that, have learned to interact. And so I think the benefit is that the class sizes are a lot smaller, so they don't have the same external factors they had before that was causing them, the mental strain or kind of the disruptive behaviors. Right now, I think it's kind of like that honeymoon period where they're all excited about school because they get to see their friends. So later down the line, who knows? Hopefully it stays that way, but we honestly won't know until later.
Greg, how do you feel about that? Do you think that children were ready to interact not just with other students but with adults as well?
Yeah, it's tried to say that kids are resilient, but kids are resilient, and so I think that for the most part they are. I think what they're going to struggle with, both the children themselves as well as the teachers, is that kids have, for the most part, like Jenny even referenced her fifth grader, they're used to having some self-regulation and a lot of autonomy. That's because they're in rooms with one or two or maybe three sibs, but they've managed their world with one or two or three others. And now they're back in a system that's requiring them to interact with 35 others, 40 others, 27 others. And, a teacher still has to manage those larger numbers now. So I think that social piece is going to be the harder piece rather than the actual just interaction. Kids are going to be wanting to be in small groups and do projects and have fun. And the best teachers among them will be doing those great engaging project-based learning activities that they've not been doing. So they'll love that piece. But I think the social piece that will be challenging is having been kind of autonomous and self-regulated. Heck, people are used to having to get a pass to go to the bathroom. And now if I want a snack and I'm an 8-year-old, I just go get it. So that's going to be, I think that piece is going to be really challenging.
Jenny, as a parent, do you think that there's anything that you could be doing at home to help your child adjust to being back in person?
It's really interesting because, as I mentioned, my kid really wanted to go back, and he's actually only back with 10 kids because they've broken them into 2 cohorts. So the whole class isn't back at once. It's only 10 kids at a time. He was so excited to go back, a few weeks ago. And usually when I would pick him up from school and ask him questions, he would never answer. I wouldn't get any information. And he was just immediately chatting me up and telling me, the games that they played and what they did in school and how the COVID testing went. And he shared so much information and he was excited. But I will say last night, it's really interesting. He woke up in the middle of the night, screaming. He had a nightmare, and he said that he had a nightmare of somebody with a gun pointing it at him and that he was afraid to go outside. And I thought, wow, he's actually experiencing some anxiety. So I think this is a really transitional period where even though kids want to go back, there's still some anxiety about the change.
On the topic of mental health, actually, I have a younger sister who is a junior in high school, and there's been an added emphasis on mental health and emotional well-being with them. There's a whole day dedicated to talking about their emotions, doing a personal check-in, a self-evaluation of where they're at. Do you think that this added focus about mental health and their well-being will carry out in the next semester or so, or will it fade fairly quickly? Greg, if you can go ahead and tackle on that question first.
Yeah, I think that the wisest administrators will make sure that it gets carried out much longer than just into the fall. I think that transition that Jenny's talking about is going to be much longer than just the end of this semester and into next fall. Think of the kindergartner whose first initial formative understanding of school is this 2D screen environment. They've not even been socialized into this thing called school that, everyone on this screen kind of agrees on a relative understanding of that. So there's going to be a longer transition. So I think the wisest among not just K-5, where I know better, but certainly K-12 will make sure that there's intentional attention on mental health. Absolutely.
And then Christian, you, as a social worker, I assume that you deal a lot or regularly with a child's mental health and how they're doing at home and as well as school. Do you think that it'll carry over or that it should carry over?
My hope is that it does. Right now, we're seeing a lot of funding going into mental health, and that's made me happy because there's I'm a strong advocate of having mental health for kids in school because there's a lot of things that they deal with, and especially kids these days have a lot of pressure from everywhere, getting their parents, teachers, just trying to measure up to other kids. So my hope is that this funding and this focus on mental health does carry over, but realistically, who knows? It just depends on the environments of the government and school districts and their focus. But my hope is that it does stay.
Did virtual learning expose flaws that can now be fixed with students returning to school? I know that internet access, home accommodations, and language barriers are all things that we had acknowledged before, but were very exacerbated because of the pandemic and virtual learning. Do you think that they can be fixed somehow now, Christian?
Um, that's a tough one because it is depend on individual each kid. But yes, this pandemic has shown disparities between students. There's a lot of kids that didn't have access to internet. So me on my end as a social worker, it was kind of my first, let's say, few months of mental health was trying to get these services for them. What are available for them? How can they get free internet? What is available? Advocating with teachers. So I felt like a caseworker rather than a therapist a lot of times during this first few months of this pandemic. But yes, now I think school districts have had a routine down for kids. They have offering free hotspots for them, Chromebooks, and all this stuff that kids are using now to just do what they can at school.
How do you communicate with your clients now? Is it all completely virtual as well? And how has that changed your interaction with them?
Yeah, so it is all on what we call telehealth. So it's through video conference, through Zoom, or phone calls through if they have cell phones, or kind of what they prefer, or what can I get a hold of them with. There's been a major difference with them because there's some level of disconnect with them, because before, face to face, they can't avoid those topics that we have go through emotionally. But now, they can easily turn off the computer, say they have internet trouble, or just hang up. So there is a disconnect, and having those activities that I normally would do with them to get them engaged, we can't really do them over Zoom, because you have to look for something that's available online, and a lot of things that are online are paid subscriptions, or just trying to find something creative. So there is this whole level of disconnection that I have felt with clients, not on their part. It's just we all had to adapt to this new world, and I'm sure teachers have felt that same level with them.
Greg, if you want to follow up with that, have teachers felt the same disconnect, or do you feel that they have? Even at a college level, you can speak on your experience with your students.
Yeah, if I'm just responding to the disconnect, I don't know. I teach, like I said, a course of freshmen, and I have 53 students. So I can't even connect with all of them concurrently because Zoom screen doesn't allow for that. That's if they would turn on their mics and if they would turn on their screens. Some of them, most of them, are unable to do that. They're living in homes multi-generationally. I don't even understand how they're even attending class, to be quite frank, because they're the older sibs sitting at a table with three other, somebody in high school, somebody in elementary, and they're being a student and also controlling the environment. Mm-hmm. So the disconnect is real. I offer office hours. We do small groups and breakout rooms, and you can connect, and even then they don't turn on camera. So it's not a matter of not wanting to interact with 53. It's like they're literally in an environment where turning on their cameras is impossible. Some of them don't ever turn on their mics even. So their entire conversation for me has been this anonymized kind of reading comments in a YouTube video, to be quite frank, because you're just reading their comments in the chats. And I've literally never heard their voice in 16 weeks. They're present, they're absolutely contributing, they're super engaged, they're fired up on the chat, but it's very different than what would be typically happening in the discourse. So there's no way for me to answer that any other way to say that teachers are disconnected. And it's true in the K-5, all of my students who are teachers would say the same thing. Different family structures have different abilities to engage in terms of turning on cameras, turning on microphones, engaging in the chat. A pre-literate first grader isn't able to contribute in the chat the way they can talk through their ideas. And, so if they can't do that in the chat, that's not going to happen, which is a lot of learning for a small human. So yeah, disconnect is real.
Jenny, what have you heard from other parents? I'm assuming that because of your work with the organization, you get to hear other parents' experiences. Have they been similar to yours? Have there been some extremely different ones?
Again, there are massive differences. It's really interesting. Some of we have an African-American parent advocacy team, and we've heard from some of our Black parents that their kid, they prefer the virtual environment because as parents, they can actually monitor what's happening in the classroom for any kind of racist comments. I think what we found is there are parents who do not trust the district and who prefer to see what's going on. And, so I think that there's some really really fascinating differences actually that have emerged, and there isn't a universal experience. And I think it's really important not to generalize too much. And certain voices have been very loud in this debate, but I think it's really important to give parents options, and that's one thing that we as an organization have advocated, is for options. That's the main message that we want to send. No one should be forced to do distance learning any longer, but no one should be forced to be back in the classroom if they want to choose an alternative option in the fall.
If I may, I just want to add to what Jenny was saying. Many of those options existed prior to the pandemic. So the challenge is having an awareness of what those options are. You could have gotten a K-12 education in this state prior, fully online if you wanted to prior to the pandemic. But it's also a matter of what's come up today. It's a matter of access. It's a matter of economic and fiscal inequalities. It's a matter of informational access. So those structural inequities, I think, are really going to be where the system of education is going to attend after this, because there's no way for us to do it. We're not going to restart as if this has never happened. We will be much better for it, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. And that's the problem. It's like steering the Titanic. The education system is so big.
You think now that people have been exposed to all of these different options, they might think about education a little bit differently moving forward? Do you see parents opting out of in-person learning from this point on? And Jenny or Greg, both feel free to answer this.
I have a coworker at Speak Up whose child was in a brick and mortar school, and she has decided to move her child to an online hybrid or homeschooling charter called iLead in the fall. And her daughter always suffered from social anxiety and really did better at home. So absolutely, one of my colleagues is exercising that option. So, even on our staff, we have vast differences. I have been dying to get my kid back. I want him back 5 days a week as soon as possible. And then one of my coworkers, she wants to keep her kid home from now on forever. So there are huge differences, and we're seeing that play out across Los Angeles.
Thank you again, Jenny, Christian, Greg. All three of your opinions were very, very great. They'll make a great segment today. The information was informative. It covered both sides of the topic, and we appreciate you being here.
This was great. Thank you. So nice to hear.
Thanks so much.
You're watching On Point. We'll be right back.
What are you looking for?
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. You can hear us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on Alley 36 and Santa Clarita Valley Television. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Justin Gonzalez.